All right, it's time for us to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, I get you.
It is, it's 7 o'clock.
You better before you
You're
go
good
to
for
sleep.
distance.
Yeah. I would say it'd be easier to pass around the clipboard if everyone sat up closer, but I wouldn't do that to you guys who like to sit in the back. As we have been doing, would someone like to open us up with the Lord's Prayer? Maybe those who are sitting in the back, maybe one of you wanted to do it. Jeff, you'll do it?
Sure. Our Father,
Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever.
We were taught trespasses and losers, not debtors, not mess up on that.
Oh, all of them are in there somewhere, and it's,
Well, we were taught, forgive us our trespasses, we forgive, now
Yeah.
they say debtors.
yep.
Do you stop?
Well, I have to. It's been about a month, and we're about a month out from the election, and if we're not saying, hey, this thing is coming up, and it's probably the main not probably, it is the main reason we're having a class on this topic, we kind of have to mention, hey, we're about a month away from it. But I want us to focus on this week, the unprecedented times. And it's really weird, because I was talking to a friend of mine, and this was back in like July. And this was back before this class really had much form, or I knew what I was gonna even talk about. And I was sitting there, and this was one of those comments, and as I was putting this class together, I kept thinking back to this conversation. Because what they had said, and they're only a few years older than me, I think I've hit my quota of unprecedented events in my life. And I had to sit there and think, you're 27. You don't have that, like, unprecedented events. And there's not much there. But I thought, okay, let's get down to the granular bit. What is the definition of unprecedented? Well, it's an adjective, and it means never done before or never known before. Well, if you're a baby, everything's unprecedented to you. If you don't know about it, and if you don't pay attention to the news or the history of the news, well, of course it's never known to you, because everything's new. It's always breaking news. It's one of those things that I always found it weird, because I used to be that kid who would watch the news before getting on the bus in the morning. And I know that may be shockers to some of you. But it was one of those that every morning when they would come out off of commercial, it was always breaking news. And it was always the same thing that they were talking about last week or yesterday, or like it was always breaking, but it was the same news that you'd already heard before. Hey, breaking news, Donald Trump was elected president. Great, he was elected president 3 years ago. It's no longer breaking news at that point. But we do the same thing with the word unprecedented. It's unprecedented times that this happened on this day at this time. I think of, what was it? I guess it was a couple of weeks ago when the University of Texas played Michigan. And at the end of the game, they're like, this is the first time that Texas has beaten a top 10 team on the road when the weather is this degree and this and this and this. It's unprecedented that Texas has never done this before. Well, Texas is a top 10 team. It's not unprecedented. They were in the playoffs last year. They are a good team, no matter how much that hurts me to say. But it's one of those, it's not unprecedented. You don't have to put a graphic up every time someone wins. It's the first time this has ever happened. It's not. You can just say, Texas beat Michigan. End of story. It doesn't have to be something unprecedented. But then getting into it, and then this graph doesn't really tell you much, so I'll describe it. The McKinsey Institute looked at news stories from about 2005 to, I guess it was 2021. Sorry. And they graphed the usage of the term unprecedented. And it looks like You've highlighted the bottom, and then you have a highlight up to the top. And it's because, as they came to find out, we have started to use this term more than they should have. Or not should have. More than we used to, at least. It's unprecedented how much we use the term unprecedented. And so thinking back to this discussion I had, I think I've hit my quota of unprecedented events. I couldn't help but, okay, I have to push back on this somehow. What do you mean you've hit your quota already? And I gave 4 examples. They named the 4 most recent ones. Never has there been a pandemic like COVID. Okay? Great. Never has someone who was running for president or was president ever been assassinated in my life. Kind of. We'll get into that here in a second. Never has there been war in Europe. That's like half of history is there's a war in Europe. Or the other half is never has there been a war in the Middle East. It's always going on. There's always a war. And so I'll give you a little bit more time than I did last week. With people you're around, or maybe you'll have to move to be around some more people to discuss this with, what are some of these unprecedented events that you can think of? And I'll give you about 10 minutes to do that discussion.
What, is this stuff we just thought would never happen and it happened anyway?
It's the things that it always, it's that, I never thought this would happen, nothing like this has happened before, like this, it's those kind of events. Sure.
Corey. At least for today. I'm good with faces, I'm bad with names. But I'll do Ann and Judy. Try to add a couple, add a couple a month and eventually might get halfway there. But I was thinking for at least my age, would definitely 9/11. I remember the day that happened so clearly.
It was unprecedented for us.
West Coast.
And I was telling you, just in the last year, so many losses.
Burned down some stuff. Death and wrongful deaths and the attack on the police. You know, understandably that there's bad apples in every job, you know, and the bad police should be punished. To just blanket say all police are bad and, you know, throw them in jail for
Disrespect for them.
I lived on the wrong side of the law for a really long time, but anytime I had a police interaction or got
That doesn't look like
I did it. I'm gonna go take my punishment. I'm not guilty, prove it, you know, and try to get out of it on a technicality.
Yeah.
No, I did what I wasn't supposed to, and
It's always great.
taught me
Then all you gotta do is change.
you're doing your job, you know, and I'm not doing my job, so, you know.
First president of Dallas.
First person in Dallas in that year,
So all you have
Yeah,
to
that's
do is add
definitely.
the details.
he wasn't even the first person in Dallas to be shot in a car
Not
that year. Like, it was just, he's also the president.
Threats on school shootings in just the last 2 months.
Yeah.
Kids.
Sure. Never.
Cause I'm not gonna be a job.
I sure hope I'm never in geometry class
I
again.
have Arizona
For
news.
some reason, geometry and like
Oh,
algebra
it's
two
definitely wrong now. It's
terrible.
nothing how it was.
But I can
when
do
go up
calculus,
there.
no problem.
You know, it's definitely a lot different. I'm glad to be going to the mission. So, they've had like 16 threats on schools the last 2 weeks. They had a threat today. They had to have a massive police presence. All the kids are scared, can't focus.
That's unprecedented.
Nothing happened.
I think about the weather. Those unprecedented times.
That's very,
Yeah, that's Mary Jane. She's in, I didn't know there was a Turner afterwards, but yeah. We're in the same Brothers Keepers group.
Yeah.
unprecedented.
And part of it's also,
We're thinking,
it's the biggest hurricane
we're
since
thinking
1900. What happened in 1900? A hurricane destroyed the National Weather Service in Galveston. Like, so we don't have a whole bunch of records
Reds
of
at
the
school.
weather because they were all destroyed in a hurricane. Well, that's where
That's
we're on.
really scary.
You guys can just go ahead and you already got.
Yeah, I guess over, if you look at history as a whole, but in recent history, they have two so close together.
Oh,
you
yeah,
know.
on the same person.
Yeah, same person.
And I guess unprecedented.
I did say 10.
Illegal immigrants. Doing illegal.
Especially now we introduced a whole new country's gang to our society. I'm glad I saw Abbott on the TV. So, treated like they get increased sentences just for being, when Colorado tried to say it didn't even exist. It's like, how can you say this doesn't exist when there's video evidence of it? And I'm all for immigration. There's a right way to do it.
Another unprecedented thing about transgender. Turmoil.
Yeah, that's really like, there's a church in Idaho, and the pastor comes out, you know how, like Baptist churches have that thing that the pastors wear over them? So he wears one up at LGBTQ, saying, you're still welcome, and anybody that doesn't show you unconditional love isn't a Christian. And it's like, well, he taught us to love, but he also told us it's right or right, and the truth will be like your hate. So it's like, it's, I mean, if you want to live that way, I still will love you, but you can't tell me to say that it's still okay now. Acceptance and approval are two different paths. Now it's just easier to be bad. I wasn't raised in the church, so it really was easier just to, I mean, it's hard to be good consistently when the whole world is like staring at you and like, that's not the way we do it. Well, that's the way you all should be doing it. Texas is like an exception to that. Anywhere you go in Texas, you pretty much will find somebody who's not afraid to say, yes, I'm a Christian. It's like, felt like everybody was atheist. Or they say, I'm a Christian, but I don't have to read the Bible.
All right, let's come back together.
How are you a Christian?
And Brissa will help us take notes on the board. What were some of those things you guys talked about in your groups that were those unprecedented times in your life?
In our life, that's what I was trying to figure out.
Or-
Leave out.
Or just unprecedented that you get to think of? I did leave out in our life, but.
The Noah's flood.
All right.
I don't know.
Oh, wow.
I wasn't expecting that one, but thank you, Sonia.
Yeah, I remember Moses like it was yesterday.
We were talking about 9/11.
9/11.
Yeah.
Lots of weather events.
Weather events.
Yeah, there's too many of those to mention.
Invention of AI.
But that goes back to building on something else.
John Kennedy being assassinated in Dallas, Texas. That's the only one we had that good.
Like you mentioned, I said female president, but he corrected me. Hillary was the first female to run, so this one is not unprecedented.
Female vice president.
I think Mexico just elected their first female president.
Sure.
He said space travel.
Space travel.
Female president.
Walk on the moon.
Walking on the moon. This group back here hasn't said anything.
All of ours were taken.
Oh,
Ah.
Oh. Meltdowns of nuclear plants.
Like the Fukushima tsunami thing.
Yeah.
I think, I never expected the political division to be so thick.
Sure.
Civil War.
Jeff.
It's almost like a
Oh.
civil war, it feels like
Is
it.
it Roswell?
What about
It's an
Roswell?
unbelievable event.
My people landed in Roswell.
That's just an alien.
I think that's the joke.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a pretty good list up here, and we've already kind of talked about some of these things, and some of them will come up again tonight. But again, those four that I knew in advance are kind of the four that we're going to talk about. So it's the idea of COVID, so pandemics and plagues. We'll kind of walk through those, and then we'll talk about assassination attempts, and we'll talk about war in Europe and war in the Middle East. Starting off first, and the list of plagues is much more lengthy than this, and this is like the top 10, and they range all the way back from 165 AD to the current day. And this is just the top 10 most deadly plagues that have ever hit. And you can see some of these are still actively going on, so they can't say, oh, it's about this percentage of the population yet. Excuse me. But we heard so much about COVID is the worst plague to ever happen ever.
No.
It's not. The Spanish flu was the worst plague that has hit, or at least so far. Because the Spanish flu took out 1 to 5% of the global population. That could, depending on counts, which again, because it's, not that they were bad because it's in Houston, not Houston. in history, sorry, but it does make it to where we don't have consistent records. But some will say it's up to 100 million people died in the Spanish flu. Well, in COVID, it was at max only about 35 million. Or at least that's of the numbers that we are getting. Because again, COVID is still one of those, it's still technically kind of going on, but you don't hear about it on the news every night, every time you turn on the TV. Unless it's one of those, maybe it will work this time to scare them. And so, it's also one of those things of, we can think of how many other of those health scares did we hear about. I can think of Ebola, the swine flu, the bird flu, the avian flu, because it's somehow different than the bird flu, and it's like we can just run down the list. Zika, and all the mosquito carried diseases, and none of those really cracked the list either. And yet those, for that time, was the worst thing to ever happen. It was unprecedented. We've never seen something like this come over. Except we have. Almost every year. The mosquitoes carry diseases. That's just what they do. And then I found this chart, and it kind of marks, yeah, it's unprecedented that you have big infections, right? But as we look at it, and as more things are reported, there's always a consistent time in which there are more people who are sick for about 4 or 5 years, and then you go about another 4 or 5 years and you have record health. It's just kind of the ebb and flow of population. And then we talk about elections. And we could talk about the elections forever. But the past few elections, yes, there's something unprecedented about them. But it's not super unprecedented, because we've talked about this election already before. The 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln wins, but he only wins 40% of the popular vote. He does have the most votes cast in his favor because there's 3 other candidates running. But the things that are on the ballots are things like slavery. Well, I guess that's really the thing that's on the ballot. But so you have slavery that's on the ballot. We're at the brink of the Civil War. All the previous administrations had sat there and did nothing to prevent the division that was in the country. And when you hear stories of, we've never been more divided than we are now, that's a lie, because we were at one time so divided we decided to fight each other in an open war. Ashley, why are you laughing?
Just a really good point, I'm sorry. I'm nervous laughing.
Okay. And then we get to conversations about, this is the closest an election's ever been. Well, except in the 1876 election, the election was decided by 1 electoral vote. And the guy who won the Electoral College had 300,000 less votes than his opponent. That was a moment in which the election was, of course, tense. The guy who won the popular vote didn't win the majority of the states. And there's a division there. In 1888, something similar happens where the popular vote comes down to about 500 votes. Imagine the election, at least on the popular level, being decided by less people than the amount of people that attend Greenlawn on a Sunday morning. Greenlawn itself would have been able to sway this election if we all decided to vote for one candidate or the other, which we wouldn't have. We're 700 something people on any given Sunday. We would have, and we of course have different opinions, and we probably would have debated, well, is Benjamin Harrison the better candidate or is Grover Cleveland the candidate? Just as we do today. There's people in our congregation who'd say, no, Trump is the best candidate we have. And some people would say, I don't think so. And they may be in favor of voting for Harris. But then we get to other elections. In 1948, it's another one of these. You have 4 guys running for president. It's a hard time. Well, it's not hard to think about. Because 2016, there was 4 guys running, or 5 guys running for president. But you only really heard about 2. And I'm sure it's something similar here as well, but it's one of those, it comes down to, it's one of those, you have people who are clearly invested on one side versus the other, and there's clear opposition to the guy who actually wins. This story, or this election, Truman is, I guess the most significant picture of it is he's holding up a newspaper, and the headline is saying Truman has lost the presidency, as he just won the presidency. People were so ready to write him off. He's so unpopular of a candidate. How can we have him? And yet he won the election, and the news kept saying no, you need to ignore this, ignore him, he's not a good president. He's just riding FDR's coattails.
Is a recount unprecedented? Seriously?
No.
Okay.
A recount in itself is not unprecedented. We're getting to the one you're probably thinking of here in a second. But one of the ones that was sent to recount, but it's not probably well known, is 1960. This is JFK's election. He is elected over Richard Nixon. Again, it's a very close race. And part of the problem is people are accusing JFK of supporting illegal measures to win the election. He has somehow committed voter fraud, or he's harvested ballots, and they keep recounting certain states because the count does not seem to match up. That we are getting more ballots than we thought we would, because the numbers don't lie. There's only so many people over the age of 18 in this state. And it actually was one of those moments in which, if we really wanted to get into it, we could have, I wasn't around at this time, so I'm not including myself in this. If the powers that be wanted to get involved in causing the legal nightmare that some took recently of trying to challenge an election, this would have been probably the most notable one. If you were going to sit there and say that. But Richard Nixon said that would not be good for the country. It would be a catastrophe. And Kennedy is a decent politician. He has decent ideas. He can be trusted to be president. I can be okay losing. That may have been an unprecedented thing. I can't think of many politicians that would have said, yeah, I'm okay with my opponent winning. I don't even think people before Kennedy would have been okay with saying, yeah, I'm okay with my opponent winning. And then we get to the one that I'm sure Sonia was thinking of, the 2000 election, because they recounted it until like December, and it was only when the Supreme Court stepped in and said, Florida, make up your mind, that Florida cast the winning vote to push George Bush over the line, granting him one extra electoral vote. If Bush had lost, Bush would not have been president. But it was Gore had the clear numbers advantage. He had 500,000 more people vote for him than Bush did. However, again, it became one of those, how could we ever believe an election could be questioned or challenged? Well, it's not even the first one on my list, and it's not the only one on my list. We think of this idea of what we have to recount it forever and ever and ever and make sure we do it right, and then we make up rules of what type of pen you were supposed to use on the ballot versus not. Well, Florida was making those rules. Florida was also then saying on the paper ballots, if your paper ballot didn't have the hole punched through it all the way, it didn't count. I bring this up because we heard those stories coming out of Arizona of, well, certain ballots were dismissed because they used a Sharpie instead of a Bic pen, and this one had a blue pen, and so that didn't count, and this one used pencil, and so that didn't count. Well, that's not unprecedented either. It's happened before. It even happens from at least in Texas, every third grader through senior in high school has to sit down and be told you can use a certain type of pencil. You can't use this type of pencil because it has number 1 lead, which I've never seen a number 1 pencil, but you can't use a black pen on the Scantron or the machine won't take it. And so this idea is not unprecedented. It's not new or anything like that. And as I mentioned before, 2016, there was 5 people running for president. Well, there was more. It's just there was 5 notable ones, or at least we're getting notable consideration. And you could even go into the 2016, there were guys who weren't even running who got electoral votes, and it's a whole mess. And 2016 was kind of a weird election because you had a guy who was not a career politician beat the career politician of the time. But again, it wasn't like the original presidents of the United States were career politicians either. You had generals, you had plantation owners, you had men who had never really governed at all until they decided, I guess I can be the guy who goes to Philadelphia and I can sign this paper that says we're becoming our own country. I guess I could do that. It doesn't seem that difficult of a thing to do. And then we, of course, have the most recent, and again, this is the one we always hear, or we can probably best remember. It's the one that's setting up so much anxiety about this one, because of, you had the legal battle, you had the questions of the legitimacy of certain ballots in certain states, and we had all of this. But again, it's not new. It's not even the first. It's just the most recent. And that brings us to that next thing, assassinations. I almost had, a lot of this I had to pare down the list, and I was kind of surprised how many attempted assassinations, assumed assassinations, or just straight out assassinations are in the United States history. And I had to pare down the list where it's not just it's not even including vice presidents or notable political figures. So we're not going to see RFK up here. It's just people who were president or were president while they were shot, or shot at, or attempted to be killed. Starting off in, that shouldn't be 1935. That should be 1835. They're right next to each other, 9 and 8. It's an easy mistake. Andrew Jackson is nearly shot by a lamp worker in Washington, D.C., as he's just outside the Capitol building. This story is a little funny because then Andrew Jackson has to be pulled off the guy because he's beating him within an inch of his life with a cane. But it's one of those, okay, that may have been unprecedented. No one else, after they get assassinated, may go and pull out their cane and start beating the guy who just shot at them. But then we go further down the list. In 1850, Zachary Taylor, he dies after eating cherries and milk. Which is a weird breakfast, but that's what he liked, I guess. And then all of the news is after is, wait, it doesn't make sense why he's dying of some poison. This is clearly a poisoning. And it's not like he decided, I'm going to have cherries and milk and poison. So someone must have poisoned him. And the pro-slavery Southerners were blamed to some extent. There was no evidence or proof that really was able to stick it to one guy. But there is the assumption that Zachary Taylor was killed by a poisoning. And then, of course, we get Abraham Lincoln, who was killed in Ford Theater in 1865. James A. Garfield was shot in Baltimore, Maryland in 1881. William McKinley is shot in Buffalo, New York in 1901. William Howard Taft's entourage was attacked. The guy got about a meter away from William Taft in El Paso, had the gun in his hand, and they just tackled him. And so I did include attempts on here, but so Taft was almost, I should not look down and speak right into the microphone, should I?
Not with the T.
Not with the T, yeah. So Taft was almost assassinated in El Paso. Theodore Roosevelt was shot in Milwaukee it's one of those, he was the former president, but he was also running for president again in 1912 as the candidate for the Bull Moose Party. And so he was on a campaign. Again, this one's a little funny because he gets shot and then he keeps talking, and it's like hours later he goes to the hospital to get the bullets removed. And so he survives. Herbert Hoover on a trip to Argentina, there's a bomb that's planted on the train because you have Chilean rebels who are trying to prove their points, and so they're going to kill the American president. Luckily, they put it on the wrong train, and so it blew up the wrong train. But it was one of those, Hoover got told, hey, you were almost killed on that train ride. And he was like, let's not tell my wife, because she would not enjoy that. FDR was nearly shot in Miami, Florida, and in the shooting, the Chicago mayor was actually shot and killed by the gunfire in 1933. Harry S. Truman had several letter bombs that had been sent to the White House. However, under Truman, the White House was being renovated, and so Truman was not actually in the White House. And so he survived those. Of course, we get JFK's assassination in Dallas, Texas in 1963. Richard Nixon was nearly shot outside, or in Ottawa, Canada, outside the legislative building. The Alabama governor who was traveling with Nixon was shot and was paralyzed. That was George Wallace in 1972. Gerald Ford was nearly shot in San Francisco, and a nearby cab driver was killed in 1975. Jimmy Carter was nearly shot in Los Angeles in 1979. Ronald Reagan was shot in Washington, D.C. in 1981. Bill Clinton was nearly shot at a shooting outside the north lawn of the White House in 1994. George W. Bush had a grenade thrown at him in Tobolsk, Georgia in 2005. Barack Obama's White House received several letters laced with ricin toxin. And then, of course, you have Donald Trump was shot in the ear in Butler, Pennsylvania this year. Assassinations is not a new thing. I was almost surprised with how many assassinations of presidential figures there were, or near assassinations. And again, you don't really hear about them, but there's also those that you do hear about, the MLKs, the RFKs. We can run down the list. There are notable people who have been assassinated before. It's not a new thing for someone to try and kill a leader or someone who's speaking out. What about wars in Europe? I had to pare this list down to just the ones that have happened since the 20th century. And then I started writing the list down, and I was like, okay, maybe just the notable ones, or just the ones with notable countries. And then I started writing that list down, and I was like, okay, maybe the ones that I can pronounce the name of, and we'll do that. And so, wars in Europe. In 1904 through 1905, you have the Russo-Japanese War. Russia goes to war with Japan. In 1911 and 1912, you have the Italians are at war with the Turks. In 1912 and through 1913, as some might guess, the Balkans, who have never agreed, are at war with each other because they've never agreed except for that brief period where they're Yugoslavia and they were too afraid to have a war. 1914 through 1918, of course, you get the war that was supposed to end all wars, World War I. And then in a couple years, you get World War II. After, there's already other wars that are happening in Europe. You have the Russian Civil War, you have the Hungarian revolutions, you have the Austrian Civil War, you have the Spanish Civil War. After World War II, you have the Greek Civil War. And then you have another Hungarian revolution. And then you have Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974 and 1989. You have the Romanian Revolution. 1990 through 1992, you have the Transnistria war, which is over a strip that's even thinner than like Delaware. Like, it is a tiny strip of land, but we went to war for 2 years over it. And then you have, for 10 years, from 1991 to 2001, you have a series of it's the Yugoslav wars, but it's also a series of wars. But then if we're counting a series of wars, that's kind of what World War II is, because it's all happening all over the place. And then you have the Georgian Civil War going on as well. You have Russia is invading Georgia. You have Kosovo, who's trying to break free of Serbia. And of course, you have Russia invading Ukraine. Again, it's not new for there to be war in Europe. If anything, the list could be much longer about how unrare it is to have a war in Europe. A list that is longer, the wars in the Middle East. Again, this is only going back to the beginning of the 20th century, and we're starting in, I can read them off, and I may just do it, because I don't have that many more slides. No, I won't. That's a lot of things to read, and I cannot pronounce them all correctly. But you can just take a minute and read. There's wars in Saudi Arabia. There's wars in Syria. There's wars in Jordan and Lebanon and Israel and Palestine and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Oman and Egypt and Libya and Algeria, and just keeps going on. And they're always at a war with each other, and there's then the wars that are fighting against European powers or with European powers, and then the United States gets involved, and we're going to fight the Iraq because they invaded Kuwait, and then we're going to fight Afghanistan because they're sheltering terrorists, and then we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and it's not new to say that there's wars in the United States, not in the United States. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's not new for there to be wars in the Middle East. And it's also not new for the United States to be involved in these wars either. This list is also much more lengthy because then you get into I included some of the wars against the Native American tribes, but for the most part, all of those wars that are considered wars are left off this list. But the United States has been in Revolutionary War. It's a war that we don't like to claim because we lost it, but we did go to war with Algeria, which if you look at a map, doesn't make sense for why we were fighting Algeria so quickly after the Revolutionary War. But to some extent, we have the United States Navy is glad that we went to this war because that's why we decided, hey, maybe we should actually put money into building a navy. And so the Naval Department was formed, and we began to produce boats, which does then lead us to the next war, which is the Quasi-War, where the British didn't like that we were building a navy. And so they sent their fleet to try and deter us from building our own navy. And they didn't win, and they claim we didn't win, but I'm pretty sure we're not speaking their type of English right now, so we did win. And then they tried again in 1812, and again, we didn't win, but they didn't win either. So it's more likely that we won than them. And then for some of us who are waiting for Texas to show up on the scene, the United States gets involved when Texas decides to go to war against the Native Americans. And you have, of course, now that we have a relationship with this Republic of Texas, Mexico says they're not an independent country. The United States says, I'm sure they are. And so they go to war with Mexico. And we go and get involved in the Pacific, and we say, with all the European powers, hey, we don't like how China's controlling the opium trade. Before we came to the realization that it's probably not good to have everyone addicted to opium. And so we went to war for opium. And then we had the not the second Civil War, I'm mixing up my lines. Then we had the American Civil War. Then we blamed the Maine on Spain, and we went to war with Spain. And then there's wars because we blamed the Maine on Spain, and we won Cuba and the Guam and the Philippines and the Virgin Islands, the Solomon Islands. Like, we pick up all these former Spanish territories, and then they don't like that we are controlling them, and so they go to war with us. I didn't put those on the list, but those were also there. And then we get World War I, and we get World War II. And everyone's involved in World War I and World War II. That's why they're called World War I and World War II. And we're involved in Korea, and Vietnam, and the Gulf War, and the Yugoslav wars, and the war in Afghanistan. And we get involved in the Yemen Civil War. And we get involved in Iraq. And then we get involved in Syria's Civil War. And then we could list all the things that we're kind of involved in, but we're not, and then we're paying people, and then it all ravels apart. And it brings us, and this is kind of where I thought we'd end, but we have 15 minutes, and so if you have questions or you want to just talk with your partners, that's cool too. But this brings us to that phrase from Ecclesiastes. What has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. There is no such thing as an unprecedented time, especially to God, right? Going back toward it helps if I speak English. Going back to, no, that's not the right one. Going back to our definition of unprecedented. Something that has never been done, or something that has never been known to have happened before. Well, Ecclesiastes says everything's already been done. War has already happened. It's not new. Famine has already happened. There's droughts. There's poor harvests. It's not new to have a drought or a famine. It's not new to deal with a plague. It's not new to have pestilence, or it's not new for people to die. Everything has already happened. But beyond that, nothing that's new, or nothing can never not be known to have happened before. Especially to God, because God knows all of history. He knows what will happen. And he knows everything that is happening, and he knows everything that has happened. So if there's nothing ever new, there is no such thing as unprecedented. I would go so far as to say it's become the buzzword that we have to say just to mask our anxieties. I'm anxious, I'm fearful of what's going on because everything's new. Well, of course everything's new if you're always thinking in the moment. We spent the past 3 weeks kind of working our way through, and I don't know if you've made the connections to some of the things we talked about. I hope you did. But it wasn't new when churches got involved in politics. It wasn't new when churches were removed from politics. It wasn't new when we had revolutions. It wasn't new when there was unrest in the streets. It wasn't new when people got shot for what they said. It wasn't new any of those times. Sure, this scenario may have never happened before. There may have never been 2 sanitation workers that got killed in the streets of Memphis because of faulty technology. That may have never happened before. But it doesn't mean that there's never been someone who died because the government or the society that they were in said, you are a lower class citizen than I am, and so they end up dying because of what they're surrounded by. I think of Jeremiah and his message specifically to the leaders of Jerusalem. He's telling them, look out for the hungry and the poor who are on your streets. Look out for the fatherless, or at least you were supposed to. Maybe that's better. You were supposed to look out for the hungry. You're supposed to look out for the poor. You're supposed to look out for the fatherless. And yet they're the ones who are living on your streets, who are dying, who are sick, and you have done nothing for them. Well, how many other prophets had come before Jeremiah? At least 10, saying the same thing. Look out for the people you're looking down on. That was your job. You were supposed to take care of the least of these. Years later, we get to the point where this guy named Jesus comes onto the streets and says, you were supposed to be taking care of the poor, of the lame, the blind, the mute, the paralyzed. You were supposed to be feeding the hungry. You were supposed to be doing all of this. Even our instructions aren't unprecedented when Christ says it. But to the people in the Gospels, it is brand new. They've never heard this story before. And I wonder how many times, because I can kind of relate to this, I'm wondering how many times Jesus did this, because I know Paul probably did this as well, and Jeremiah did it, where they go home and they just beat their head into the wall. Why are they not getting it? Am I speaking a different language than them? I'm telling them what they should have already known. Moses came down and the law is clear. You're not supposed to be predatory towards your neighbor. You're supposed to take care of your brothers. You're supposed to help those who are less fortunate. And yet over the generations, the message still has to be, you were supposed to do this, and because you are falling short of that, you will receive the consequences of your actions. Because you have done these things that are wicked in the eyes of the Lord, you will be punished. You were supposed to be, if you are my people, you are supposed to do these things. I want us to spend some time, and maybe this could be a discussion question. Actually, I think it will be a discussion question. Turn to your partners or the people around you and discuss, how are you being a light for Christ in these unprecedented times? And that'll be our last question for the evening. And so whenever you're ready to leave, you can. But for at least the next 10 minutes, spend some time talking with your neighbors about that.
That's a hard one.
Yeah, it's pretty. What's your name?
How are you doing?
Good to see you in our country. Everyone has a right to speak. But if we change that, we don't have to. She is, and you agree to this. Been here about a couple of months. Here, but very good. We look at it as Christians. Understand that we don't know. He's talking about things that we should do. There's things that you're not supposed to do, but we do both. And so, we're supposed to live by it.
I think all of us, though, if we look at it every single day, then we're all gonna do that share right now, because it's hard that every single day, how am I being that light to somebody? But I think overall, just we all are on our way, but we have to be
Most of those
active
is more out with
about
all
that,
years ago, any knowledge. Most of the things that go wrong
I never had a dog that doesn't stop barking. Every single time I sit down to do homework or go to bed, the dog starts barking. The second I sit down on my laptop or close my eyes.
You gotta forgive them.
Yeah. No, I'm not mad at the dog, but, mark my words.
So the big question in our life is, Jesus made
The same thing where they talk about
He's made a way because he knows we
the
have.
person that gave all their gold that they wanted, that they could part ways with, compared to a lady that gave 2, but all she had was 2. Which one carries the value? You do all that you can, or do you come up short to purposely keep yourself in a comfortable Well, that's hard, because
So being alive is looking to the interest of others rather than yourself. And it becomes hard because at first you get up in the morning and you think, what do I need to do? Who is my good deed today? And then after a while, the habit, that's what you think of first. Think of the interest of others instead of yourself.
and then it's automatically in your schedule and everything. It doesn't even feel like you're doing
Doesn't
it.
have to cost money. It does take time. It does cost time. But also, so I read lately, we all do what we love. So everybody is here 24 hours a day, and we all do what we love.
Jesus is
So
our
we have to
sins,
put
and
this,
it's no more.
what am I doing?
So if we're not held
And what am I
accountable,
loving?
he no longer knows us.
That's why
How
I'm
we
spending my
Christians.
time with Jesus. And I know, time and my money, not there for
Say,
but it's all for the
having
glory of God. It's all for the glory of God.
That's the important part of why I'm doing
That's
And Luke, there's.
Tell us about yourself.
Seems like.
So how long have you lived in Bergan?
I may be.
I was 21.
And you're in school?
Yeah, I'm back in school at LCU, going for my master's in accounting.
Right.
Well, I get my bachelor's not this Christmas, but next Christmas, then the following
You said,
Christmas
but
will
you
be
said
my
you will deal with
So
the
how are you
goats,
not
and then
doing
you'll
that?
deal with the other. You said the same when you deal with the
life changing. I didn't grow up in church. You know, I got baptized in 2016, and I've read the Bible, and I've always considered myself a Christian. You know, but I lost my son in 2017. I got a DUI with him in the car, and I was in jail, and I was homeless.
That's it.
I was
Keep it all
homeless
together.
for a long time.
That's what we want.
And I only came here to get back in my son's life, and my
I mean, that's what I
in-laws
believe, but
come
I'm
here.
saying I've often heard
The
everybody.
Mains and the Griffins,
says
my
that.
in-laws.
So even though you
Linda,
you still have to do that.
Kendra, and Jimmy Griffin. So they have custody of my son. So I only came here to be supportive of him.
This opportunity, one of those.
And I was like, you know, no interest in joining, you know, tell me the first thing I don't wanna hear, so I can hurry up and make my excuse to not come, you know. And I tell Dale all the time, we're in a Friday morning group, it's like, every weekend you tell me something I don't wanna hear, and I'm thankful for it. So, it's been really kind of different, you know, my family doesn't really talk to me anymore because I've changed my life, except my father, who spent my entire childhood in prison for abuse. You know, I've forgiven him completely, and now he's the only one in my family that we even talk to each other. And he's a Christian, and now he might be moving out here.
So you're
Cause
really,
cause I'm telling him, you know, at Greenlawn, they really do forget and forgive you of your past and care. And you can come here. Yeah, Adam's my son. Yeah.
It's kind of like,
Thank you. You know, and it's a lot thankful to them, you know. And
I deserve.
I'm thankful to be just a part of that.
All the tries I've checked off in my life.
That's where I try to be like,
Good things that I did.
my parents never talked to me about, you know, this is a God's situation in your life.
Those things I wasn't supposed to do, I did those.
Well, yeah, my grandparents were atheists, and my dad.
All right, I don't want to interrupt your conversations. I know you guys are having some good ones, but I did forget to make a comment about where we'll be going next week. For those who have been waiting for this to get out of the history lesson and into more of the Bible, well, you're in luck. That's what we're going to be doing next week. And we're going to be thinking about the idea of whose authority should we listen to as Christians, as the church. So we'll be talking a little bit about authority next week, and we'll be in the Bible more than we have been. But that's all I've got. I did say that was all I got before, but now this is really all I've got. And the bell's going to ring any second now. So thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, y'all have a good week.
So,